The Star Wars galaxy was a pretty diverse place, with conditions that differed dramatically from region to region, from the wealthy and largely urbanized core worlds, the poverty-stricken backwaters of wild space. Many of the galaxy's regions had a reputation for being full of danger, but none of them could top one region that you've probably never even heard of: the Trans-Hydian, also known as the Borderlands for a few years after the Battle of Endor. But while most fans probably won't recognize the name, we guarantee you're familiar with at least a few of the threats that called this region home. The Mandalorians, ancient Sith, and Zygerian slavers among them. The Trans-Hydian was packed full of the most dangerous places in the galaxy, and in this video, we'll be providing a quick overview of the region.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Trans-Hydian stretched between two of the galaxy's most important hyperspace routes, the Polemian Trade Route and the Hydian Way. These two routes ran in parallel from the core into the galaxy's northern half, enclosing a somewhat narrow strip of space between them. The Trans-Hydian was the outer portion of this strip, stretching from the border between the Inner Rim and the expansion region all the way out to wild space. Most of the region was grouped into the Outer Rim, including all of the Trans-Hydian's most infamous subregions. The core of the Trans-Hydian region is plainly visible on many political maps of the galaxy, even when the region itself isn't explicitly marked. For example, in the map of the Clone Wars that we currently have on screen, the heart of the Trans-Hydian appears as a region of unclaimed space in the top right that stabs pretty deep toward the core, separating two regions of separatist space. On a population density map, the Trans-Hydian is visible as two great voids in the northeast, vast stretches where the average population per inhabited planet per sector was less than 1 million. These voids take up roughly 2/3 of the Trans-Hydian, and they're surrounded on all sides by much more densely populated areas. This anomalous desolation reflects the Trans-Hydian's history. As we've discussed in the past, early Republic colonization efforts were overwhelmingly aimed at the Slice, the region between the Polemian Trade Route and the Corellian Run. Only after the Slice was pretty much fully explored did the Republic begin to push north and south past the borders of this region. In the south, this new wave of expansion opened up the trailing sectors and eventually the western reaches, but in the north, expansion happened at a snail's pace. When northward expansion did begin to accelerate, it still gave what would be known as the Trans-Hydian region a wide berth, to the point where the expansion region and mid-rim narrowed to extremely thin strips around the border of the Trans-Hydian. No Republic colonists or explorers were willing to push deeper in that direction until very late in Republic history, and once you learn what was out there, you won't blame them. Now, before we get into the horrors of this region, it's worth pointing out that not all of the Trans-Hydian was desolate. The region included corridors of well-off and heavily populated worlds along the Polemian Trade Route and Hydian Way, which extended decently far into the region in the former case, and there was also a much thinner strip of well-populated systems along the Salen Corridor, which bisected the region just past the borders of the Mid-Rim. That was pretty much it though, and even in these ostensibly civilized regions, there were still plenty of horrors. We're going to go through the dangers of the Trans-Hydian in order from the region's coreward end to its rimward end. We'll start with the region just beyond those weird narrow stretches of the expansion region and mid-rim we mentioned earlier, the tract of space that Republic colonists avoided like the plague. That was because just beyond those narrows was Mandalorian space, as well as the adjacent sectors the Mandalorians liked to raid. In modern times, those sectors were still inhabited, but very sparsely so, and for a very simple reason. The Mandalorians killed virtually everyone else in them, and they themselves were steadily dying out. Mandalorian space itself was full of battle-worn, thinly settled planets, some of which had been bombed into white sand deserts by the Republic. These were the ancient trophies and clan worlds of the Mandalorians, and many millennia of war had rendered almost all of them barren and or close to uninhabited. The sectors surrounding Mandalorian space were even worse off. large tracts of graveyard worlds whose empty ruins testify to the brutality of ancient Mandalorian crusaders. The Mandalorians were the most corward of the ancient hostile powers that lurked in the Trans-Hydian. They were also much less of a threat in modern times than they had once been. While Republic colonists had once had to give the Mandalorians a wide berth to avoid extermination, in modern times, the Mandalorians had become the only one of these Trans-Hydian threats to actually join the Republic. They had become somewhat integrated into Republic society, and their territory had been entirely encircled by more civilized regions, which meant that this innermost region of the Trans-Hydian was much less dangerous than it once was. But its history had left it depopulated, and Mandalorian raiders and pirates meant that it was still more dangerous to travel than many other parts of the galaxy. On the other side of the Salen corridor from Mandalorian space, you had another desolate, if slightly less interesting region, a stretch of sparsely inhabited backwater worlds, most of which were part of the Gordian Reach sector. The Gordian Reach was a scattered collection of mining worlds, minor industrial planets and obscure colonies, one of those regions of space that just had very little going on in it. Most of it was lawless, and for millennia, it had been home to bands of pirates and rebels. It also contained a bunch of navigational hazards, most prominently a nigh impassable wall of nebulae known as the Royal. And beyond the Gordian Reach was nothing at all, a huge, stellar-poor region of space known as the Radama Void. Travel in the Radama Void was perilous as navicomputers struggled to get their bearings in stellar voids, and hyperspace malfunctions would leave spacers stranded hundreds of light years away from the nearest star, never mind the nearest inhabited planet. Spacers usually navigated around voids rather than trying to cross them, and the Radama Void was no exception. On the far side of the Rama Void was another set of nebulae, a ring known as the Stygian Caldera, and enclosed within this ring was one of the most infamous regions in the galaxy, Sith space. This subsector was home to the 120 original subject worlds of the Sith Empire, including such nightmarish planets as Ziost, Dromund Kaas, and Korriban. A few additional Sith worlds lay not far beyond the Caldera, such as Thul and Malachor V, but every single one of the great strongholds of the ancient Sith was located here in the Trans-Hydian. In ancient times, this was a region of pure horror, an empire built on the backs of slaves, the blood of exterminated peoples, and the corruption of the dark side. In modern times, these worlds were tombs, avoided by everyone except tomb robbers, archaeologists, and pirates, still saturated in the power of the dark side. The Sith were perhaps the greatest threat that the Trans-Hydian called home, but beyond Sith space, there were actually even more hostile powers deterring expansion into the region. The Turvig slavers, Circerdian pirates, and most infamously the ancient Zygerian slave empire all called the rimward end of the Trans-Hydian home, as did lesser outlaws such as the Onaka gang. Pirate bolt holes like Turvisis, Florum, Cadavo, Zygeria, and Sikerd were pretty much the only inhabited worlds in this region. Most of the others had long ago been plundered, and their people had been sold into slavery. The Jedi fought numerous campaigns against the slavers in this region, including one in which they destroyed the Zygerian slave empire, but they were never really able to loosen the outlaws' grip on the Trans-Hydian fringe. In the modern era, however, the most horrific place to be in the Trans-Hydian actually wasn't any of the regions we've discussed so far. The worst part of the Trans-Hydian lay at the northeast tip of the region, a densely populated cluster at the very end of the Hydian Way. This was the corporate sector, the dystopia to end all dystopias, particularly during the time of the Empire. The corporate sector was a small fiefdom ruled exclusively by a collection of corporations that together formed the Corporate Sector Authority. The CSA's member companies had exclusive rights to all resources within the sector, and they completely controlled the government, the corporate sector's military forces, and every aspect of the lives of their employees. These corporations were all powerful and completely unaccountable, and they abused this in every conceivable way in the name of profit. The list of horrible things that went on in the corporate sector is really a video of its own, so for now we'll stick to the highlights. Officially, the corporate sector had no indigenous sentient species. an oddity that CSA-funded scientists blamed on local stellar anomalies. In reality, the sector was home to 11 sentient species that the CSA considered its property and treated as slaves, plus dozens of others who were completely exterminated to make way for strip mines, industrial plants, and resorts. The ESPOS, the corporate sector's police, were allowed to get away with every conceivable act of brutality so long as their employers were still making profit, something facilitated by the fact that people in the corporate sector legally did not have any rights. Instead, they had privileges that they had to maintain through consumption and labor. Pay and promotions were determined by constant, ruthless competition, protections for workers were non-existent, and consumerism reached extremes that can hardly be imagined, with advertising worming its way into every waking moment. There's an argument to be made that even the Sith treated their subjects better. As we've mentioned many times, the Trans-Hydian was avoided by scouts and colonists for almost the entirety of Republic history, but that didn't mean the history of the galaxy passed the region by. In many of the Republic's most destructive wars, the Trans-Hydian made up the core territories of the enemy. It was the core of the Mandalorians' territory during the Mandalorian Wars, and the heart of Sith empires during the Great Hyperspace War, the Great Sith War, the Jedi Civil War, the Galactic Wars, and even parts of the New Sith Wars. During the time of the Empire, Imperial forces attempted to pacify and settle the region, while the Rebel Alliance had one of its most important bases in the Trans-Hydian on Yavin 4 in the Gordian Reach. During the Galactic Civil War, the Trans-Hydian became particularly important, especially after the Battle of Endor. In the first few years after the Battle of Endor, the Trans-Hydian was the core of Warlord Zinja's territory, and Zinja established much of his military infrastructure there. After his death in 8 ABY, however, the region was split between various Imperial factions and the New Republic, which fought many battles there over the scraps of Zinja's empire. For this reason, the Trans-Hydian became known as the Borderlands, a place where battles were fought not just between the Empire and New Republic, but between different Imperial factions as well. The New Republic had driven the Imperials out of the Borderlands by 10 ABY, but its grip on the region remained tenuous, and the Imperials began using the region as an invasion corridor for assaults on New Republic space. The Borderlands thus remained a battleground until 14 ABY, when the New Republic took control of the Hydian and forced the Imperials away from the Borderlands for good. But the Borderlands would retain their new nickname for decades afterwards, and they would continue to see action in future wars. So that's our look at the Trans-Hydian, one of the most dangerous and fascinating regions of the galaxy. But what do you think? Would you like to see a more in-depth view of the Trans-Hydian one of these days? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.